Hello, everyone, and thanks for showing up for our monthly meetup today. For those who do not know me, my name is Rubby Golo, and I look after Global Chamber in Accra, Ghana. I also run a consultant firm called Global Trade Consult. We help overseas companies expand into Ghana with their products and services. Just a few housekeeping rules. If you can keep your microphones on mute until we get to the Q&A stage where you'll be invited to ask your questions. Global Chamber is the only chamber that operates in many locations, and our business is to help companies expand internationally. Today, we are very fortunate to have Keyaan Williams of Class LLC, who is a passionate advocate for risk governance, successful development, enterprise risk, cybersecurity, and data privacy programs for a range of organizations. We are so fortunate to have him present to us today. Keyaan, thanks for your time today. Please tell us more about yourself and what you have to present to us. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Again, I apologize about the technical difficulties. Today is not my day for technology, but thankfully technology allows all of us to come together from all over the world. I have been a member of the Global Chamber for a long time. I consider it a privilege to be able to present this content. The content is a summary of research that I've been doing for over 5 years. What tends to happen is that when people are doing risk management, everybody operates within a silo. So financial risk managers will focus on financial compliance and regulatory requirements. Technology risk managers focus on technology, but there's very little that brings everybody together in a cohesive approach. Part of what Ruby and I put in the tagline is the idea that many businesses cease to exist when they have a major risk event. A major risk event can be anything as a root cause. It could be a cybersecurity incident. It could be a natural disaster. It could be political upheaval. It could be war. We have over 100 wars that are going on in the world simultaneously. And in all of those cases, a risk event creates an outage that impacts the organizations. And if they don't have the right risk management programs in place, they're not going to be able to recover. My primary work is focused on cybersecurity, and that's what a lot of people know me for. If you choose to connect with me or if you find me through the Global Chamber, you're going to see it as a cybersecurity themed approach for my day job. But my real work is helping board directors and business executives understand what to do and how to do risk governance so that from the board of directors perspective, permeating through the entire organization, everybody understands what's going on. I could talk to you for an hour because I'm a professor and I'm a lecturer, but I did put slides together. Ruby will make sure that these slides are available to the audience after the conversation. And the purpose of the slides is to help you follow along and understand what we're covering. As I go through the presentation, please keep your thoughts and questions in mind. At the conclusion of the presentation, I am happy to answer any questions that you have about the content that we covered. I didn't put a lot of content about myself in the presentation because I want this to be an academic or an educational tool for everybody. My hope is that the content that we print today educates, informs, and inspires each of you to think differently about enterprise risk management, to think about governance. And with that, we'll talk about the theory of risk governance. Afterwards, we'll talk about the practice, and then the floor will be open for any questions, comments, or concerns that you have. Before we talk about risk governance, it does become important to understand what corporate governance is. Corporate governance is the system of rules, practices, and processes by which a company is directed and controlled to balance the interest of an organization's many stakeholders. When we say many stakeholders, this is a variety of people. It's employees, it's customers, it's regulators, it's legislators and the government in the country where the company operates. All of those stakeholders are going to have some concern about how everything operates. One of the tools that we talk about in the presentation is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, also known as the G20, and the OECD defines principles of corporate governance such that at a national level, individual companies within a nation have practices that they're supposed to follow for creating trustworthy systems, for stable markets, and for everything else that's going to support transborder, cross-country flows of information and economic activity. Again, is not just about the cybersecurity or the technology aspect, but it's about every part of the business that comes together, equipping an organization to deliver what they're promising. Related to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, because you'll have these slides, or if you choose to take a screenshot, I highly recommend looking at two artifacts that OECD publishes in every odd year. These documents usually come out in September, so they say 2023 right now because they're the most current documents. By September of 2025, the new versions will be provided. The principles of corporate governance describe the practices that are acceptable from a global perspective. That is the foundation for the conversation that I built for today. The OECD Corporate Governance Fact Book focuses on the results of implementing the practices across organizations. The OECD looks at 49 jurisdictions, so that even though I'm in the United States, the perspective is not based on what we think here in the States. The perspective is based on 49 different global jurisdictions that have adopted these practices, that use these practices to influence the national perspective. And then based on the national perspective and cross-border collaboration, there is a framework for oversight and management of systems that produces trustworthiness and resilient for markets, for economies, for business activity, all of those things that are related to and the reason why we're members of the Global Chamber. With governance in mind as a overarching foundation, risk governance focuses on the institutions, rules, conventions, processes, and mechanisms by which decisions about risk are made. And then based on those decisions, you're going to implement a collection of practices to reduce the cost of a disaster. As I said in my opening arguments, anything can be the root cause of a disaster. It could be a natural disaster like a tsunami or an earthquake. It could be political upheaval. It could be a coup. It could just be a simple power outage. Most organizations do not have a good plan in place to say what is a disaster for our company, what are the mission essential functions provided by the organization, and what investment is necessary to ensure those mission essential functions remain in place, effective, and positioning the organization to deliver what they promised. It's this aspect of risk governance that's the focus of my conversation. If you choose to take a screenshot, I encourage you to do so. This diagram that you have on the slide is a modification of multiple standards. What you see at the top with the number 1 in the green triangle represents the board of directors and the chief executive officer in any company in any jurisdiction. And it is from this green triangle that the rest of the foundation of organizational hierarchy works. The idea is that the board and the CEO at level 1 establish governance practices for the organization based on rules from OECD and national regulations and other requirements. You have your C-suite at level 2, where you have the chief of everything that exists within the company, the chief human resources officer, the chief marketing officer, the chief revenue officer. All of those people, as it indicates on the left of the slide, representing the C-suite, are going to direct and manage activities for corporate operations and the corporate mission of the organization. It's then at level 3 where you have systems and data that are managed by line level staff, by employees, by vendors and contractors. At the top of the pyramid, you have a broad risk-based approach where the rules are set for the organization by the board and the CEO. At the bottom of the pyramid, you have a detailed and granular risk perspective so that I understand key risks that happen at the system and data processing level within the organization. The reason that I highlight the pyramid and the reason that it's such a powerful artifact is because at level 1, it is the responsibility of the board and the chief executive officer to identify what are the specific measurable exposures for the key risk areas that the organization faces. Our risk areas are listed on the slide. Those areas are revenue, resilience, regulation, and reputation. I like to call them the 4 R's of risk but all of these work together to influence the economic viability of a business. If we don't manage revenue risk, then there's an impact on financial efficiency. We potentially don't have the resources or the budget necessary to cover the cost of operations. From a resilience perspective, if our systems aren't up and running and are unable to deliver products, services, and results, then it has an impact on revenue. It could have an impact on our stakeholders. From a regulation perspective, there are numerous regulations. I think the European Union is the most regulated continent in the world, given all of the requirements that they have in place. And I only mention the European Union not to disparage them, but to highlight that one of the aspects of the European Union is that many of the rules that they've established follow the citizen based on the country of origin rather than following the location that the business practice is done. As an example, the General Data Protection Regulation creates obligations for any company anywhere in the world that is processing personal information of a citizen from the EU or the European Economic Area, and awareness of all of the regulatory requirements for the organization becomes extremely important so that the risk for not following regulations and the penalties and legal enforcement that are applied are addressed in a timely manner. Related to reputation, I used to tell my graduate students that reputation was not really that important. And what I found over years of research is that reputation, especially for small businesses, has a significant impact on the organization because of switching costs. Switching costs is a economics concept that looks at the difficulty of a consumer choosing to work with one company or another. And where switching cost is high, a risk event that causes a bad reputational item in the news has low impact on an organization where switching cost is high because there are few providers in the marketplace. Where there are many providers and switching cost is low, all it takes is for one customer or one stakeholder to be unhappy, to share that in a Google review, to post it on social media, and then a company starts rapidly losing all of their customers. All four of these risk areas have to be considered as part of the process. What risk governance does, thinking about the word governance and the definition that I provided, risk governance allows organizations at the leadership level to focus on the most important things. For any company, there are only going to be so many most important things. It's not everything, it's not the demands of all of the employees. What generally happens is that given the four risk areas, one of those risk areas is going to be the most important for a specific company. And then one of those risk areas, whether it's revenue or resilience or regulation or reputation, there's going to be some attribute or some risk event that has a significant impact on the most important thing for the organization. Given the exposure and the impact of a risk event, it's up to leadership at level one in the pyramid to think about what resources are necessary, people, process, and technology for us to put in place to make sure that those risks are managed at an acceptable level. And then execution should align with formal standards like the OECD principles, like the COSO framework that looks at enterprise risk management, or national laws, standards, and requirements that provide good guidance that people can follow consistently, that people can follow consistently and evaluate effectively. As you go from risk governance to risk management focuses on everything else in the company. Governance happens at tier one, management happens at tier two, and it creates opportunities for the C-suite and the staff within the organization to execute whatever strategy was defined by the company. There are many things that matter in the organization, and the things that matter, not the most important things, become the responsibility of human resources, of IT, of cybersecurity, and all of those other C-suite leaders. The decisions about what matters can be delegated either at the C-suite level or at level one, where you have people working on systems and services. Ultimately, everything has to operate within sound risk boundaries. You have a concept called a risk appetite statement based on a risk appetite framework that is originally rooted in the Financial Stability Board, which provides regulation and guidance for banks. And so if financial institutions globally are using the recommendations from the FSB to establish their risk appetite and risk capacity, this says that almost any organization in the world can think about the amount of risk that is acceptable in pursuit of business value and the maximum amount of risk that the organization can accept in this pursuit. What this produces is the position of an organization at some point on a risk scale. Some companies, like banks and financial institutions, are going to be risk averse, and they're going to do everything that they can to avoid risk. Most companies are going to be closer to neutral. Some companies, like startups, artificial intelligence companies, software as a service companies, are going to be much more aggressive, and they're going to accept more risk in pursuit of outcomes that are going to be beneficial for the organization. The placement on the risk spectrum and the practices for risk governance and risk management in the company are going to influence the practice of risk governance overall. Typically, if we look exclusively at cybersecurity, but considering that we could repeat this conversation for any risk area in the business, operations, IT, finance, human resources, anything else, almost all of the areas in the business have the same shortcomings where there's a lack of standardized measures, there are informal analysis methods, there's a focus on the system level where you do data processing using technology, there's significant complexity, and there is insufficient asset information where people don't understand the technology and data that they have, where it exists, who has access to it, and the value that these assets bring to the organization. What ultimately ends up happening is that the operation of risk management in silos causes everybody across the organization to focus on the thing that they care about most without having an enterprise perspective that allows the entire organization to work together to solve problems that benefit the greater mission and the impact of the organization's efforts on their stakeholders. What the risk appetite framework does is it brings all of those silos together. It allows governance decisions about the acceptable level of risk, and it forces the organization to document what is our capacity for risk taking, what is our appetite that says how much risk we're willing to accept, what are the limits before a risk event causes us to go out of business, and then what are the risk profiles where risk profiling allows an organization to compile all of the risks and then rank prioritize issues that happen within the organization. This prioritization becomes very important because you only have so many resources. Even the government of a nation has limited financial resources to respond to risk by putting controls in place, by acquiring insurance, by transferring risk. Because you are eventually going to run out of resources, risk profiling becomes very important to help an organization ensure that limited financial resources are addressed to the most significant risks first. And then once the significant risks are addressed, everything else can be taken care of based on priority. Very few companies take time and invest the effort that's required to formally document profiles for risk, assign those profiles, and then assign resources to reduce risk to an acceptable level. From an enterprise risk management perspective, the risk profile is extremely important because it informs all of the decisions about the capacity, the appetite, the limits, and it leads the organization at tier 2 in my pyramid and at tier 3 in the pyramid to make the right decisions, not based on what an individual feels, but to make the right decisions based on what the board and the CEO have said at tier 1. Now, I'm giving you a lot of information in a short amount of time. I recognize this. The COSO Enterprise Risk Management Framework provides one of the best documented solutions in the marketplace from a global perspective to help organizations address all risks in every process, department, and fiber of their organizations. If you take what I'm referencing and align it to COSO, there is consensus with the idea, whether it's COSO or it is the OECD or it is any national regulation, that everything for success starts with leadership, flows through the organization down all of the tiers. Every employee has a responsibility for risk management, and there is assurance that risk is controlled and is a shared responsibility within the organization. The minimum requirements for success are really based on prosecution. So there has been disaster after disaster after disaster globally, If we were in my graduate class or we were in a longer form session, we can do case studies, and most of the case studies highlight that the fundamental problem with organizations is they don't have a program that's well designed, the program doesn't have appropriate resources, and the program doesn't work in practice. And so what my team and I have done doing academic research, and I've done this with some of my students for the university work that I do, is we actually looked at what was the impact of risk management as an outcome for penalties that are assigned by the courts when a company has a failure. And so if there is a oil rig that collapses, did we have a program in place? Was it well designed? Was it well resourced for safety? Or if there's a cybersecurity incident or a ransomware attack, the same framework that are the fundamental questions during prosecution influence the harm that's done to the company or the reconciliation that's required through some kind of financial penalty or remedy assigned by the courts. Artificial intelligence is a really big area for a lot of people, and I really don't want to turn this conversation into an AI conversation, but there is a specific remedy that's assigned by the Federal Trade Commission in the United States that is gaining traction, that is starting to be assigned in Europe and Asia, that's called algorithmic disgorgement. Disgorgement has existed a long time. It is a legal remedy in a lot of cases. When you apply the remedy of disgorgement to AI algorithms, what ends up happening is that if you did not have good risk management for the use of artificial intelligence within the organization, and you illegally obtain data to train your models, the courts, and this action has taken place in the United States, the courts can tell an organization that not only are you going to have to pay a fine or a penalty, but you are also legally obligated to delete the model, to delete the output, and you can no longer use it. And so if you think about the amount of research and development, effort and investment that goes into machine learning, large language models, and generative AI solutions, and we didn't do risk management, we didn't think about whether the data capture was legal and authorized and from appropriate sources, the worst case risk management scenario is that you end up in court and the courts tell you that you can no longer use what you created. We don't care how long it took or how much money you invested. And so using AI as a specific example or using cybersecurity or ransomware or anything else, all of this produces an outcome where it becomes extremely important that organizations at the leadership level understand their risk, that the board and the CEO are involved in risk management decisions, that you set acceptable boundaries for what we will do and what we don't do to protect the interests of the company, stakeholders, and people who are affected by those decisions. And given that this is meant to be a learning session, this is all of the content that I prepared. I will open the floor for us to have a discussion. I saw a couple of questions in the chat, and we can go in that direction as we go forward.
Thank you so much. Great presentation. It's time for Q&A. Please feel free to raise your hand or just unmute and ask your questions.
I've
Okay,
left everybody speechless.
I'll go first then. So in my line of work, I have the opportunity to sit on a number of boards. And in your presentation, you did mention a lot about what the board can do. And I'm just wondering, what role should the board of directors play in risk governance and what should be their responsibility?
Yeah, one of the interesting things about the board of directors is that if we look at classical board governance, the role of the board is to provide oversight and direction and to define the strategy of the business. And then the board holds the chief executive officer accountable for delivering those outcomes. Now, depending on the jurisdiction that you're in, board directors are independent. They're not a team, but they work together and there is an interrelationship. But then independent directors have personal liability and accountability for doing good risk oversight. I know much more about case law in the United States, but we have a thing called a Karamark standard in the US. And based on that standard, there was a collection of board directors who were independently prosecuted because somebody died from listeria from eating ice cream. And the issue in the courts was that if you're on the board of directors, you have a responsibility to the stakeholders. People eating ice cream were stakeholders of this company. It was the board's responsibility to provide oversight for food safety, and the board should have asked better questions and should have required that the CEO and management provide good evidence that legally required food safety practices were in place. And so most of my work, again, focuses on cybersecurity and data privacy. But everything that I've said was intentionally designed to be a conversation about how does the board, how does the CEO, and how does the organization address any risk area. Like I work for the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, so I know a lot about public health. We could do this entire conversation from a public health perspective and never talk about cybersecurity, but the outcomes are the same, the requirements are the same. The board is going to set the standard, the CEO is going to facilitate execution, staff and everybody else are going to do the work that was required. Everybody's going to be happy.
Brilliant. Thank you. Audience, your questions. Let me go into the chat and see.
Ruby, I thought there were more questions in the chat, but I think they were your regular announcements.
Yeah. Please don't be shy. Come up with your questions.
Hi, this is Demetrius Evans from Chicago. Hi, everybody.
Go ahead.
That was an amazing presentation, Keyaan. But so I sit on a couple of boards, right? One is Global Chamber in Chicago, where I'm actually the chair, and so I'm over here shaking in my boots, like, what? I might get sued. But no. On a very serious note, I'm wondering, as a board of director for some of the organizations, not GC, it's as if the CEO, the CFO, someone else in the organization, they will make presentations to us. Right. So then I get that we need to ask more questions, but I always think of like security as the techie. Those are the techie people. So they know way more than I do about the technology. So I'll leave it to them. I'll ask, but really I'm educating myself. So I'm not necessarily asking from this professional expert point of view to even know which questions that I should be asking. So can you speak more to that, to the asking of questions, to how much education, how much research a board member really needs to do? And I already am going to presuppose that you're going to say, Demetrius, this depends on what type of board. So I mean, let's take it from, like, I don't know, whatever we might consider the average board.
Yeah, again, I continue to focus on a classical model of governance because you have lots of private equity firms and venture capital firms where the board directors are operators. They're not just doing governance. And so if we focus on the classical model that includes governance, one of the things that becomes very important is the idea of a fiduciary board member where you're working on behalf of the stakeholders. You're not an employee in the company. And as a fiduciary, what most governance text says is that you have a responsibility to be educated and informed and aware of the risks that the organization is facing to ensure that you're providing proper oversight in your role as a board director. I would say that if we look at the Securities and Exchange Commission in 2023, when they proposed their cybersecurity rule, one of the things that they said, but it was removed and I disagree with them, but they said that board directors have an obligation to be educated about cybersecurity so that you're not just seeking outside advice and counsel, but you are also understanding what is the right answer to a question and what are the right questions to ask. It varies greatly from organization to organization and from board to board what is going to happen and who has the right expertise. I think there's a lot of value in bringing in outside advisors, outside educators, outside consultants. I don't want to turn this into a consulting conversation, but I've had numerous opportunities to just go to the board retreat for some organizations, and we'll have an informational session, kind of like this conversation that we're doing with Global Chamber, and say, hey, this is how it works. These are the questions that you should ask. A friend of mine is the chair of the audit committee for a public bank. And as a case study, I just walked with her over coffee through what the chief information officer presented to her at the board meeting because she was concerned that she didn't understand it. And I said, friend, what you were presented was rubbish. They didn't tell you things that were important, and you are personally going to be at risk because of the content that was included in this. I encourage you in your next meeting or at the committee level to go back and ask these follow-up questions. And these are the ranges within which the answer should exist. And so those kinds of things become much more valuable and set everybody up for success. Ruby, if you'll let me pause for just a minute, my technology issues continue, which is why I turned off my camera. I'm going to connect on another device. I can still hear you guys, but if somebody wants to ask the next question, I will transition from one device to the next.
Okay, we'll allow you to transition, and then we have a hand up actually. So see you back then.
Yep, give me just a moment.
You are ready to go. Thank you.
Yeah, you want to ask your question?
Sure, I do. Sorry, I hope you didn't hear that sound in the background. Hi.
We did. No worries.
Thank you very much, Jen. That was an excellent presentation. My question really has to do with corporate governance and I would say market maturity, because a lot of boards this side of the world may not necessarily be as mature as the corporations out there in the US. And we sometimes have a running battle trying to get them to understand why implementing some of those controls and governance structures and systems are important. Now, it is an ongoing conversation, and by and large, more people are beginning to see the sense in having corporate governance instituted. Are they, I would say, simple tools or checklists or processes that can help us to bring more companies who are seeking to grow, to scale up, and to build partnership across the world to be able to deploy something that is workable, of course, that they would have to improve on as they mature. And I'd really love to hear what your advice is in this regards. Thank you.
So I heard your question. I've been able to transition, even if my name didn't pop up. But I think that Global Chamber has a good opportunity to create a foundation to solve the problem. You know, a lot of the practices that I mentioned intentionally were global standards that are well adopted. I think that through the chamber, through doing more sessions like this, we can really start to build a community of practice for good governance to manage enterprise risk within organizations for all of our members. It's something that we can do at the individual company level, or I'm sorry, at the individual country level. Ruby and I plan to host some events in Ghana that are related to this. We're doing an extended session for a full day on May 15th, but there's nothing that stops us as a community within the chamber from continuing to have these sessions. I know a lot of practices because I've researched it academically, but I don't have all the answers. Other people are going to have good answers. And the more that we come together and the more that we use the resources and share our experience with the OECD guidance, with the COSO guidance. In the US, I use guidance from NIST. And even though I'm in the US, I also use guidance from ISO. There are a ton of resources out there. It's just a matter of working together to put them together in a way that benefits all of our members of the chamber.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? No? I do have one more question. What are the implications of emerging technologies like AI and IoT on cybersecurity, and how can organizations prepare?
Ruby, that's a 40-hour lesson to answer the question. But one of the challenges that I think a lot of organizations don't address is a very old school concept called enterprise architecture. They have the Open Group Architecture Framework, TOGAF, it's pronounced TOGAF, is one of the best tools that's never used. But I've seen in South Africa, I've seen in Singapore, I've seen in all these countries at the national level, they use something like the Open Group Architecture Framework to formally document the business processes for the nation. Based on the documentation of the business process, then they're able to identify what is the ICT for communications and technology infrastructure, what are the regulatory requirements for compliance. They document everything on paper first, and then they go start implementing practices. The issue that you end up with in a lot of organizations is that nobody has documented how anything works. Like, if I go to any one of the people who are part of this call, or any one of the people who are part of the global chamber and say, hey, can you show me a formal documented business process map for 100% of the critical processes that allow your business to deliver what you promise to your stakeholders, very few people are going to be able to do that. Part of that is because it's not what people do when they start a business. When they start a business, they say, I want to make money. So I'm going to do import export, and I'm going to find the right person. Doug is going to help me connect with the right person in the right country so that I can start making those connections. But if we never go back and document the process, how do I ship a product from country A to country B? And what is all the technology involved and what's all the regulation involved? If I don't have that information, it becomes impossible for me to say, will AI enhance or have no impact on this process that's critical for my business? Or is it some other digital transformation going to have some impact or no impact? So many companies know so little about what is necessary for their critical business processes to do what they're supposed to do, that it's honestly academically impossible to make a decision about do I or don't I adopt some new technology. Today, artificial intelligence is a very exciting thing. What I think, personally, based on my research and my knowledge, is that quantum computing is going to have a bigger impact on the world than artificial intelligence, because everything that AI does now is going to happen 100 times faster when everybody has a quantum computer under their desk instead of a regular computer. Everything that we do with computers now for breaking encryption and for dealing with cybersecurity issues is going to be 100 times more difficult. And so in the cybersecurity space, a lot of people in the profession are talking about, AI is used offensively and defensively, and people with artificial intelligence can automate attacks. But what happens when artificial intelligence works 100 times faster? And I don't know how my environment was designed, and I don't know what my critical infrastructure is, and I have no knowledge about my communications technology that's deployed in practice. And then if we start talking about manufacturing facilities, because we have great members of the Global Chamber that are involved in manufacturing, it's even worse for industrial control systems, because the manufacturers of control systems are trying to encourage people to put their human machine interfaces and the programmable logic controllers in the cloud. But if it's in the cloud and I don't control it, now I'm trusting a third party to control my critical systems and services. And I'm also having to trust that they're going to put the right controls in place so that the attackers don't compromise my infrastructure that has a significant impact on my ability to deliver what I promised, whether I'm producing widgets or I'm producing aluminum or I'm producing a component for something that is a part of another machine that somebody else is building to make the world a better place.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are open for more questions.
Okay, Ruby, I'm assuming that either my answers are so great I've left people speechless, or it is so boring that people have gone to sleep. If I gave us some key takeaways just to set everybody up for success, I think it's extremely important for the leaders of businesses, because we have a lot of leaders that are members of the chamber. You have to know what are the most important things for your business. Like, I can't run my business without the internet. I can't run my business without specific repositories of data that I've created and customized over a decade. Some of my academic materials I've been curating for 20 years. If I lose all of that and I had to start from scratch, I might as well become a potato farmer or a real estate mogul. I can't continue to run the same business that I run. And that's really the key message for what we promised in this presentation. If people don't pay attention to their assets, if they don't know the critical assets that produce value for the business, if there's no plan to protect those assets and recover those assets when a major event occurs, 2/3 of small businesses go out of business when a risk event occurs, not because of the event, but because they had no plan to recover. My advocacy and my shouting from the rooftop is to encourage everybody who's part of the Global Chamber to make sure that you are prepared to recover. Like, I spend a lot of time with lawyers, and I appreciate 𝗵𝐻 sharing her thoughts. She mentioned her board work, but she's also a great attorney. But what ends up happening with attorneys, if we just use that as a specific example, the American Bar Association in the United States requires attorneys to protect information that allows them to provide competent representation for their clients. And so if I have a data breach or if I have ransomware and I run a legal firm, I have violated the principles of the practice of law and the practice of my profession because I didn't put some controls in place to prevent ransomware, and ransomware is preventable. Where I saw a question in the chat about quantum computing. Quantum computing is so complex, and China and the United States and the United Kingdom and on those 3 locations globally are in a race to create the next generation of computers that are going to process data so much faster. But if we're processing data faster, it means that attacks are going to be more efficient. What I encourage everybody to look at on the quantum computing side, especially if you're on a board of directors, is thinking about risk management and quantum computing is all related to encryption. Encryption standards for providing confidential or for protecting confidential digital information are all going to change. By 2030, we're all going to be doing new things. But most companies don't have an inventory of the encryption solutions that they're using now. And if they don't have an inventory, they can't say whether or not what they have now satisfies the requirements for post-quantum cryptography. So PQC, post-quantum cryptography, becomes an important concept. It could be a follow-up lesson, but these kinds of things require an inventory of your assets, knowledge of how the business works, where the risk exists, and it's really up to business people, not technology people, to ask these questions. The technology people are going to provide the answers, but how many of the people in Global Chamber have gone to their technology executive and say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how ready are we for post-quantum cryptography, and what is necessary for us to upgrade our encryption modules? Because a wholesale migration of encryption from old things to current things is going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars in very large organizations. That's something that needs to be planned in advance. Most CFOs are going to be really annoyed if you come to them out of the blue and say, hey, next year I need to spend $50 million and we can't spend money on anything else. Otherwise, everything that we do to protect data is no longer going to work.
Okay, we have Diana, your hand is up. Would you want to ask your question?
Mine is not a question per se. You know, Keyaan kept asking whether his presentation was boring or whatever. That's why we're not talking. it was like, I said, wow, so it means being on all these boards, some of us are, demonstrating at-risk behaviors because we don't really bother to find out the processes or whatnot. We just look at it from a point that we are supporting. So let's just give a hand to these organizations. And it's an eye-opener. We realize that we need to be more careful and then look at what the inherent risks are, know what they actually do, know the inherent risks before we think about directing from a higher level. So it's a great eye-opener. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yes, my pleasure.
I do agree. And with some of the things happening in Ghana with some board members being questioned, I think we all have to be careful how we play our role as board of directors. I think we do have another question in the chat. Let me see.
Ruby, there was a question about the quantum computing. I posted a link in the chat that talks about post-quantum cryptography from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Excluding China, everybody in the G20 has agreed that what NIST in the United States is doing is what everybody else is going to follow. There are geopolitical reasons that China wants to go in their own direction, but almost everybody in the global chamber, if you look at the NIST link, they talk about the encryption issue, but then they also provide resources to quantum computing. It's a good place for people to start to get ready. Everybody should be ready by 2030, but it's already 2025. And digital transformation for an entire organization, 5 years is a good roadmap. But if you wait until 2029, it is going to be very difficult and very expensive.
Okay, thank you for that. 𝗵𝗕, your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you very much. A very good discussion so far. I couldn't speak because we had heavy thunderstorm here just a short while ago, just subsiding. So my question really is a combination of a question and observation. Now I'm in Lagos, Nigeria, so I'm resident director for an EOR entity, a multinational. What they ask us to do, because they are not present here, we are basically their face, their front end. But at the back end, you really can't control what's going on. I'd like to ask if there are any safeguards that you think one could apply. But I'm also a lawyer here, but I just want to have your perspective from your standpoint. What do you think would be the safeguards that one could apply in doing this work better? Thank you very much.
When we get into safeguards, there are a number of solutions that are going to vary based on the type of organization and the type of technology that you're using. The fundamental safeguards are going to be access control, encryption, because it provides confidentiality, and incident response, so that when you have an incident or a risk event occur, you know exactly what you need to do. Beyond those three fundamentals, it starts to become very industry specific. Like there is a standard from ISA and IEC called 62443 that is a collection of 14 documents if you're doing industrial control systems for manufacturing. Or ISO has a 29100 if you're dealing with personal information, so that you make sure you have the legally required safeguards for protecting personal data, not based on GDPR, but just based on an international recognized, agreed upon standard for protecting personal information. One of the challenges when you do risk governance at the board level is that somebody at the management level has to do an inventory of all obligations that the organization is facing. And then based on that inventory, the board can make good risk decisions. Because the logical question for the board, if I have an inventory that has 20 items, my first question is, have we satisfied the requirements for all 20 of these items that are in the inventory of obligations? If the answer is yes, then we can move on to other things. If the answer is no, my follow-up questions become, one, why haven't we done what is an obligation for the organization? Another follow-up question would be, what is the cost of satisfying the requirements? a third logical follow-up question would be, how soon can we meet the requirement? What I found in my travels globally is that many organizations are willing to not satisfy the obligations of a regulation because the business outcome on the positive side is significantly greater than the risk of fines and penalties if the regulators catch them. And most regulators don't have enough resources to catch everybody. And so now it comes down to an integrity issue. At the board of directors level, do we have sufficient integrity from independent directors to say that we, the company, are going to do the right thing because it's the right thing, not because we're worried about fines or penalties or somebody catching us doing the wrong thing? And one of the things that they say in governance training, I'm the chair of the governance committee for a board of directors, so I'm responsible for all the training for new board directors. The culture of the company is influenced by the decisions that happen at the board level. And so governance isn't just about managing risk, but it's also about what kind of company are we? How are we going to behave? What is acceptable in the things that we do? And you have Enron in the United States as an example of the wrong way to do things. You have lots of examples of the right way to do things. But most of what is going to happen is the result of decisions and behaviors that are driven by the board, that influence the priorities of the chief executive officer, that then influence the priorities of the C-suite. And then if you have accountability in the company, what the C-suite does based on the board and the CEO influences the behavior of all the staff within the company and the management of risk presented by third parties and vendors that you're working with. And I know that was a long answer to a short question, but I don't know enough about our representative in Nigeria's company to give a specific answer. Also, intentionally, I was trying to be as broad as possible so that the answer applies to as many people as possible.
Thank you. 𝗵𝗍, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does, more than does even. So thank you very much.
Okay. I think we have a...
I'm thinking that I answer questions like a lawyer, and that was just a long way to say it depends.
Great. Kiki has a question. Is AI a threat to information and data protection?
So the question about data protection is similar to the answer that I gave to 𝗵𝗍. For data protection, you just have to have an inventory of all of your data. You have to understand the attributes of the data. And then there is a specific practice for data governance that causes you to have approaches for creating records, using records, controlling access to records, determining with whom the records are shared, and then determining a process for destroying the records when they're no longer required. And that creates an entire framework for data protection that then influences other controls.
Brilliant, thank you. I see we have our CEO, Doug, in the audience. Doug, would you want to say some few words to close us? Okay, I think he's left. Cesar, are you there to say something?
I'm here. Thank you, Ruby, and especially thank you, Keyaan, for the amazing presentation. I apologize, I'm a little bit limited on voice today, but it's always great, Keyaan, to learn about this topic and how important it is. I was actually talking to a friend yesterday who he's a professor and he went to St. John's University in Queens, and he was telling me about a lab, a cybersecurity lab, where they have I think around 10 PCs. They're disconnected from the world, and the students, they run some simulations on cyber attacks, and then every day the computers reset and they start again the other day. It was very interesting. So definitely, Keyaan, something that every company, no matter size, no matter where they're located, needs to pay attention to. And thanks everyone who joined us today for this session.
And for those interested, we do have a workshop coming up in 15th of May. If you want to learn more, please feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to share the full details. Thank you all for coming today. Great conversation. Keyaan, thank you so much for your time and sharing all your knowledge and tips. You've actually made me get thinking of things that I need to do to protect my business and of course, in my role of board of directors as well. So I've taken away a lot of points. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure to be here, and I apologize for the technical difficulties. I will get my act together soon.
That's okay. All right. All the best to everyone and see you next month.